Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. We're shooting live from downtown Phoenix today, and we're hosting a very popular show called Knowledge Management. And so what I wanted to talk to you today was about knowledge management and how it can enable your organization to perform at a higher level. As you'll note, the title of the presentation is The Art of Knowledge Management, but I want to assure you out there who are more engineer-oriented, there is a science to this, and it is an actual science. But the art of it is getting people to understand and buy into it as to how it might improve their organizations. So a lot of times when you use the term knowledge management, people will look at you and probably think, oh, you must be talking about computer data or some kind of other automated processing. And although that may be a facet of it, it's not really the heart of it and the core. And so when we talk about knowledge management, we're talking about information and knowledge. And when you start to think about those two things, you realize that information really pertains to data and to facts that have been organized in a certain fashion. For instance, you might say that we have X number of employees in the organization. That happens to be a fact. But as you start to think about it, knowledge is something that's collected in the human brain. It's know-how, it's the way that we look at the world and react to situations within it. And the only way you can get that is through experience. So if you look at the idea of we have 4,000 employees in the organization and you have to meet payroll this week, you have a fact that you have to do this certain thing. But if you can't make payroll and don't know what to do, then you're in trouble. But if you have experience and knowledge and realize that you can actually borrow from another fund to meet payroll temporarily, that's where the knowledge comes in through experience that I have an alternative way to handle this set of facts that I have to deal with. But it breaks down from there too, because there is tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge. And I know it starts to sound to get a little complicated, but explicit knowledge is really a set of rules. And I think we're all pretty familiar when you have a set of rules that you have to go by, what that means. It's all laid out for you. But tacit knowledge really refers to this idea of know-how. So I have a set of rules that tells me how to do something, but let's say I'm very experienced in how to do it and something came up that doesn't fit within the rule set. Now what do I do? For a new employee, that may be a very daunting task to figure out, well, I don't know if I can go beyond those rules or not. But for an experienced person who's been working in the job for a long time, they may say, hey, you know what? I've seen this before, and although it doesn't fit within my rule set, I know how to handle the situation. So this is this idea of tacit and implicit knowledge and how it can enable your organization using the proper tools of knowledge management to perform better. So the next slide is, if I knew then what I knew now. And I like to use this slide because when you walk in cold to an organization and you have to function in a management or a leadership position, you often wonder, where do I start? And when you look at these organizational needs, it seems pretty obvious that you'd want to focus on these areas. But you'd be surprised at how many organizations tend to maybe focus on one or the other of these things, but don't necessarily take a comprehensive picture in and put it together. So when you look at knowledge management and organizational needs, it's really a tool that if used properly and looking at these different 10 facets, you can begin to get a comprehensive picture of your organization. You might not be able to fix all of them or do something with them at once, but certainly you can get a pretty good picture of how your organization is structured and how it's functioning. So why is this important? Why is it important to DOTs? And I think that if you look at where DOTs were before 2009, before the economy really went bad, we'd been operating under a set of presumptions for a long time that transportation funding was going to continue to grow, that as workload increased, we continued to get more employees. But the economic downturn really shifted that whole idea of how things function. And suddenly agencies found themselves challenged budgetarily to say, we're not going to get more money. In fact, our revenues are decreasing. And based on the way that state governments are looking at things, they're not really interested in hiring more people. So how do you continue to meet the needs that you have with the people that you have in the face of declining revenues? And this is the challenge that we face in the 21st century as DOTs. Even though some states have gone ahead and enacted some help programs to bring in additional funding, the public still looks at us from the standpoint that we want you to operate more efficiently with what you have and get more out of your systems and out of your people. And we want you to run in a very different way than you have before, because transportation is no longer about going from point A to point B. It now involves a whole new aspect of life that's been brought to us by connected automated vehicles, by cell phone technology, by apps, a whole host of things that the public expects us to do. So changing demographics out there are very important. We have up to 5 generations in our workplace. Some of us are a lot more technologically equipped than others. Others, like me, are probably a little bit behind that curve. So as you look at your organization, how do you meld those different generations together? But more importantly, in the case of knowledge management, how do I take the experience that you have after many years, well, some years of work, and transfer that to a new or mid-level employee, so that someday, when you're ready to hand off the responsibility, the person coming in has that knowledge that you've gained, so when a new situation doesn't fit their rule set, they can go, oh, I remember when MJ told me this would happen, and this is how to handle it in the organization to make sure that it gets done properly. That's an example of knowledge transfer in the organization. And that loss of experience in the workforce, as we older employees matriculate out and new employees come in, becomes a really big challenge for DOTs, especially when you have a lot of knowledge retiring and walking out that door. What are we going to do with those new employees walking in so they don't make the same mistakes that we have in the past? So that's why it's important to DOTs, because this loss of experience is a major challenge that we face across the country. So what are we doing in this area of knowledge management? There's been a U.S. domestic scan program. It's called Advances in Transportation Agency Knowledge Management. It's a summary report prepared by Francis Harrison. And there's a value proposition that we're trying to share with DOTs about knowledge management to get not only the CEO level interested, but all of the managers and supervisors within the organization. And that the workforce transition is creating an explosion of information and challenges and opportunities. So we would use knowledge management to overcome those challenges as far as this explosion of information and how we deal with it, and to improve delivery of the transportation projects and services, as I talked about, with increasingly limited resources. So this idea of knowledge management as a science I mentioned before, it just didn't pop up recently as the latest fad. It's an evolving, multidisciplinary, multifaceted collection of practices. So in the first generation, remember I mentioned that knowledge management is, a lot of times people think of data and data processing. It started out that way. It was emphasizing this use of technology to discover information if necessary through information storage, but also how to transfer it and move it around. And then in the 2000s, we started to focus on how knowledge is created and transferred and applied within a business context. So this has evolution from this data-driven model, this machine model of knowledge, to this culture of people driving the information and sharing it between themselves, whether they're using automation or face-to-face contact to share knowledge. So today, we're actually in the third generation of this, and it's this application of knowledge to codify, link, process, create, and discover. Remember what we talked about, explicit knowledge, that know-how. How do I move that from my brain into yours so that we can share that know-how, and you can work situations and responsibilities based on the experiences that I've had, and I can share in yours and do that also. So during the domestic scan, we talked to some companies out there, because DOTs aren't the only ones talking about this. Gamification is a very interesting subject that we talked about, and it's run by a company called Accenture. Essentially, you've got a company of 43,000 people around the world. How do you share knowledge amongst them? And the solution they came up with is that they use sort of a in-house Facebook type application and you post things that you're working on or experiences you've had to the company Facebook under your account. And the gamification comes in by the more that you post that other folks find relevant, click on and like, the more likes you get, the awards go on your website. And so the company looks at that when they're making decisions about how involved you are, how many things you've published, what you've shared, and those become either promotional or other reward type opportunities. So it's an interesting way for a company that size that's worldwide to be able to share its knowledge among employees. So who has the cheesiest macaroni out there? Kraft, right? We all know about the cheesiest macaroni. But where does that recipe for that cheese lie? It's in somebody's head, we found out as we talked to Kraft. There really wasn't a record of how to make that and how the formula worked to produce that cheesy flavor. And so they created a knowledge book. And what they did was they codified a succession plan for mission critical positions because there was only one guy in all of Kraft Foods that had the recipe in his head. And how are they going to take that out of his brain and share that with other people in order to continue their manufacturing of their product? So they've created an interactive PDF outlining job duties, the technical formulas, the chains of command and everything. And then they wanted, after they split into two foods, they wanted to make sure, or two companies, they wanted to make sure each company had the technical knowledge to produce their food products. And so succession planning became very important to them. And so from Kraft, we go to outer space, NASA. And NASA's Space Shuttle Challenger and Columbia disasters are very familiar to all of us. But what NASA did was take knowledge management, this whole idea of lessons learned, because they sat down after these disasters and they took them apart and dissected them and said, what can we learn from these mistakes? And DOTs often are doing this right now after projects are finished. Their group will come together on a lessons learned and talk about what went right, what didn't go so well, and what areas they might want to focus on to improve. So NASA had the ability to take its mistakes and learn from them, but most importantly, they taught their mid-level managers in the process to speak up and say, something is not right here, and we need to hold on to the project for the moment until we figure out what the solution is to correct this issue. So these lessons learned meetings became a standard practice within NASA and very important to ensuring that they didn't have future disasters. One more example, and that's Virginia VDOT, Virginia DOT. They've taken a leadership role in these 10 facets of knowledge management. Remember I put up the 10 business things? Well, just analogous to those business ideas are facets of knowledge management. And their DOT secretary created a knowledge management office. That's how important they felt this was within their DOT. So that office collects, preserves, and shares the institutional knowledge of its agency employees to benefit their culture and future products. What's interesting about Virginia DOT is it's not just a recent creation. This has been through at least 4 or 5 secretaries of transportation. It's a practice that has survived throughout their organization. So as we look at the last slide, the 10 facets of knowledge management, I think you can see where we had the earlier slide talking about the 10 things you'd want to know about your business. They're pretty analogous. And if you can agree on 10 things that you need to know about how your business is operating, I think you can look at the 10 facets and say those are pretty important to an organization that's going to be successful in the future when it comes to the whole idea of implementing knowledge management. It just makes good sense. So in closing, knowledge management is a culture change that we believe will pay forward in any organization, especially though in DOTs. It answers the needs that are faced by many DOTs in transforming their operations to meet the demands of the 21st century. So the knowledge base that we look at in veteran employees needs to be transferred into our younger workforce. It maximizes the ability of an organization to provide efficient services and project delivery. I mean, we are constantly faced with this out there of work smarter, not harder, be more efficient. And if you employ the principles here and share the knowledge and put these within your organization, you begin to see how your organization can actually become more efficient in what it's doing, even if all you're doing is lessons learned after a project. Emerging technologies are on everybody's radar screen, and we're going to have to be able to adapt to those. These are not something that we as an organization can ignore, and it will be very important that our employees share knowledge about emerging technologies, because DOTs are going to be called on to handle, at the very least, automated and connected vehicles, if not a lot of other new technologies that are coming out. So ultimately, knowledge management will help an organization to define its culture and its ability to adapt to change. So DOTs in the 21st century are just no longer transportation organizations. They're really becoming knowledge organizations that are specializing within transportation, within the transportation community. And they're trying to be sure that they deliver transportation projects into a system that works efficiently, because let's face it, the transportation system really provides the necessities of life for all of us out there. And it's our job to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible and extracting as much value as we can from the system. So knowledge management is certainly one of those tools that will enable you to do so. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, patience in listening to me, and learning about knowledge management.